Okay, so we're going to round robin and introduce yourselves. So I am Addie Cobb. I am with Varro. We are a biotech startup. We operate in hardware, software, and microbiology. And I am going to be moderating this fabulous panel. We're waiting for one of our panelists, but I'll let you guys start by introducing yourselves, your role, and your organization.
Cool. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Smyth. I'm a Irish export. New to California, to New York, to London, about 20 years now in Holland. I lead Alkemio. Alkemio is a digital platform for collaborating in the spaces between organizations, not inside, but between organizations. And we use open source as a way, because all of our platform is fully open source, as a sort of guarantee to the market that we cannot extract from you. It's safe to put your business collaborations onto Alkemio. And we couple that with a governance model called steward ownership to really hammer down that we're there for the common good. You try to basically stimulate better collaboration in those spaces.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Farrell. I'm CEO and founder of Securitix. We're a long-time open source provider of software skills and services. So over 20 years operating in Ireland and delivering kind of software services and projects right across both private and public sector. I guess from our role really is that kind of system integration role, maybe that kind of last few yards to the street where we take a lot of the projects, and a lot of these are already curated by large vendors that we work with like Red Hat, etc., and delivering work into that space. So we've lots of experience starting with things like Linux, moving into Kubernetes. We've always worked in high performance computing, which led us to machine learning and AI. So I'm happy to share any insights I can in terms of what a kind of successful open source based commercial run business.
Hi, I'm Sebastian Raible. I work for Appel. We're the European Open Source Business Association, and we're essentially an umbrella organization that the national open source business associations are members with. So they have the businesses as members, we have the associations as members on the top, and we do raise awareness for the importance of open source and digital public infrastructure, in particular in Brussels. So I'm based in Brussels, have been there for 10 years. Used to be a policy advisor in the European Parliament.
Fantastic. So a lot of different opportunities to look at the execution of commercial open source. Why don't we start by talking through what open source practices has done for your business and the success of your business, how you kind of have seen that come together through your journeys. And why don't we start with you, Sebastian?
Well, I guess the question doesn't directly apply to us as a representation of businesses, I mean, I do talk a lot to the policymakers in Brussels and try to inform them of those opportunities that come along with open source.
Well, that's absolutely important for business. that's how you do business.
I guess for us, so again, look. The landscape has changed a lot over the last 20 years. I mean, when I first started the company, it was to try and bring what I thought the benefits of open source were to kind of the Irish enterprise space and the Irish public sector space. So the goal really was to try and do that in a kind of a safe and secure manner. I mean, 20 years later, events like today happened. It did not happen 20 years ago, I can assure you of that. And there was a lot of advocacy needed to kind of get people to work with that. And I think for me, what I noticed was, pretty early on, you needed to do two things. You needed to bring kind of the smartest people you could into the room, and we have lots of them today, and you need lots of commercial empathy, right, to work with people who wanted to work with open source, because it wasn't the road most traveled. And over time, what I noticed is that open source is like an innovation engine, right? So we look globally at what's happening, and then we try and manage those kind of global trends and bring them in a safe, secure deployment manner for people in Ireland. And when you do that, you realize that as all these things change, sort of the business doesn't change. So what has open source done for us? We still need to bring the smartest people into the room, and you still need loads of commercial empathy, because if somebody's starting with a Kubernetes project today, that for them carries a certain amount of risk and a certain amount of unawareness of how open source may actually benefit them. So we're basically using open source and working in harmony with that to make sure that the clients get the benefits of using it right in the most effective way. And open source is like stunningly good at underpinning lots and lots of work today from an infrastructure perspective. So that's kind of that software infrastructure space is particularly where we play, integrated all that together. So it's been a huge change for us. And I mean, we have business today that employs people, it's profitable, and is genuinely making a difference. And we work with some very large clients in Ireland, both in private and public sector. So I think, that is what open source has delivered in the Securitix context. And it is doable if you understand. I say you have to really understand how open source works. And then if you do and work in harmony and not against that, I think you can have a commercially successful business.
Cool. I guess it's my turn. So for us, we're taking a slightly different approach into open source. So we are saying we work radically transparent. Everything we do is open source. You can see it, you can look at it, you can go down to the depths of the code, the algorithms, how it's implemented, all the way into the infrastructure. And that is a wonderful mechanism to build trust. Right? It's a way to actually give a promise into the market. Yes, we have a hosted service. You can go there and create this space for collaboration quickly, easily, fast, with all kinds of best practice knowledge. But hey, if we do something bad or we try to extract value from this market, you have the opportunity to run this platform yourself. So it's a way of basically sort of being open and sort of saying, actually, you can have it, but actually you want to make us sustainable. So therefore, you actually want to sort of use our services. So you actually get the ease of deployment as well as actually making sure that you get the network effect, etc. Because what I see a lot of the conversation happens around open source over the years is that it's how do we support the hobbyists up in the attic who are doing their code and give them a bit of funding, right? And that is a certain model. And then people say, well, actually, then I can use it in my context and get it for free. And then you have the red hats evolve in the world where actually, no, actually, it's not enough just to get code. You have to get the services to allow people to use it. And I think where we're going to, particularly as we have lost a lot of trust in the kind of digital foundations on which society stands, I think we actually want to build back that trust. And I think open source can be a very powerful way to build back that trust in these digital foundations on which we depend.
Oh, it's a fabulous highlight. We have Phil joining us, so what we're going to do,
Sorry about that.
It happens, right? We'll roll with it. So we're doing introductions, a little bit about your company, and then how open source has kind of driven your business forward.
Yeah, certainly. So I run a company called Flax and Teal. We're headquartered in Belfast, and we work internationally. So with projects and people across self-confidence, even though we're a relatively small company. For us, collaboration is pretty key. Part of our DNA, Flax and Teal was originally started to try and enable and encourage the adoption of open source and creation of open source in sectors that maybe weren't traditionally code producers or code enabled. So basically trying to bring more open source benefits to non-technical audiences, whether in research science or government elsewhere.
So you talked kind of a little bit about network effect, and clearly, Sebastian, in you have quite a network effect. I wonder how important open source is to building a strong future and helping to support maybe indigenous businesses wherever they may be, right? And it's really a question for all of you. I don't know if any of you'd like to start, but
I mean, it goes back to the point I gave in my intro. I mean, if you can use open source as a way to prevent extraction, right, which is a simple thing, right? Because if someone controls the code and they control the functionality and they get that network effect, that's dangerous because they're in a position of power, right? By giving the open source, you actually take away some of the power. You make the playing field level. You make it much easier to trust each other in your interactions.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think with open source, I mean, as I say, the trustworthiness, especially as we move towards things like AI. I mean, ultimately, everything that's really innovative that's happening today is open source driven. Whether you look at the big shifts that have happened, whether that's been the likes of moving from virtual machines to containers, that is an open source. Just exists only as open source. And if you look at, the way we moved from high performance computing to machine learning and into sort of the Gen AI space, again, all of that is driven by open source. That is where the rapid innovation happens. There's no other way that you can create so much change so quickly unless it is done in a proper stewarded, open source fashion. Right? So it's kind of like if you really want to take advantage of those things, you have to sort of start looking at open source and how that works. And that's where you get that sort of maybe that flywheel effect where if people want to start, and again, I was in the talk earlier about skills, and it is so important that people can engage with that. But actually open source is probably one of the easiest ways to start engaging and making contributions, even in a very simple way, to projects and getting that kind of start that you make. So if you want competitive advantage, which I think everybody in Ireland would want, you have to look forward, and as a sustainable future, open source is the foundation on which I believe that will be based.
a lot of that was what was already said by the previous two speakers is really what I see as the brand identity of open source, right? We provide the trust, we provide the benevolent providers of software and of technology, and we are very much different in that. And it connects so much. I was yesterday here already at the Curious meeting, and not in the room right now, but Daniel showed a slide of a document that was produced in 1999, asking the question whether free and open source software would enable the European information society. That was the old term for IT. And so we've essentially made all of these claims and all of these been carrying these proposals to the public sector, the private sector, and saying open source is the way to go. And I see today this is finally catching on. And I'll say in Central Europe, that is very much linked to the policy discussion on digital sovereignty and how to achieve it. And there again, all of these brand identity points, the trust and the independence from vendor lock-in and so forth, all of that comes in, and that is why in Central Europe that narrative works really well. Me speaking with policymakers a lot, that allows me to really connect. I imagine, and I have heard that it's slightly different in Ireland when speaking with policymakers, and I'm actually here to learn.
I agree with everything that's been said so far.
That's a good film.
I'm moving swiftly on. No, I think there is maybe I should stir the pot a little bit. I think there are really a varied set of ways to approach open source and business models within open source. Some of them make more sense to me than others, and one that I do sometimes wonder about. Not perfectly valid, but in terms of how that works and it benefits open source for business. Sometimes I think companies can get into difficulties, as we've seen well documented with open core models being done in certain ways, where essentially your business model is to get people who want to work with open source and then try and sell them closed source. And there is, I mean, there's a lot of examples of where that can work, but I think one thing that is really worth thinking about when working in business and open source is what is it that people are buying. I think everything that's been raised comes into this category, but it also gives you, I think, a way to position. So for example, when we go and talk to people who have no interest in open source, we talk about, transparency and accountability, because they will care about that, and therefore we also select our target customers based on that. So we don't go and talk to somebody who is focused on, and some of our customers are very IP focused, and say, wouldn't it be great if we all shared IP? What we go is to say, look, you're extremely IP focused. Do you want to work with a supplier who doesn't have an experience of sharing what we're doing? That is part of what we're doing, is putting our cards on the table, and you need to see our cards to have trust that you can build your own software. Right? So I think that messaging is a really central and tricky bit, but it also has to be the starting point, and then open source is the outcome.
I'd like to build on the point you make about the commercial models. So I actually believe that open source, together with good governance, actually particularly governance models, can be a very, very powerful combination. You actually make sure you build this model whereby you actually can be a sustainable business, super important. There's no point being a business if you can't sustain what you're doing, but in a way where actually people are confident that what you're doing in the marketplace truly is there for that particular purpose. We use a model, what's called steward ownership. Is anybody here familiar with it? Yeah. So Patagonia is right. But that is a model that I think is, pardon?
It's a B Corp thing.
No, it's B Corp plus plus. It's like a gold standard B Corp, because you cannot change it. It's permanent. You have given it away, thrown away the keys, locks, everything is gone. It's forever in that model. What B Corp is you can adjust it if the strategy changes. And those kind of models really allow people to be very, very confident in building on that open source software, because open source is great, but what if the company changes direction and goes that way, it gets acquired by Amazon or whatever, right? You have always that fear or that risk. By bringing strong governance around open source as the commercial entity that develops it, I think you have a wonderful opportunity to actually really give long-term trust and give a long-term, essentially collaborative advantage as opposed to competitive advantage.
Just like to thank you for saving me doing my talk in the next session. But yeah, absolutely. I think that's really key.
Well, so all of you are, proving that commercial open source does exist. It is successful. And so I want to kind of take it a little bit different way. Aside from just commercial business, it actually helps build capabilities within your business as well, I would assume. And I think that that's another opportunity in understanding the value that commercial open source brings to businesses in general. I don't know if you have anything to share. Would you like to start?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, for us, obviously, I think I mentioned it earlier, like we're constantly looking globally about what trends are emerging in the open source space, what's happening, and what might be applicable to an Irish consumer market, which is primarily an SME market, right, by international standards. So when we look at that, we have to skill up, we have to enable ourselves first and foremost to understand these technologies. So there's always an element of kind of research and development that goes into that in order to create a situation where if you go and the customer has an interest in that you can meet them more than halfway, because initially that's what they're going to want, right? They're going to need a lot of hand-holding and they're going to need a lot of help to kind of get those systems and to start leveraging those themselves. And where that fits, I mean, I think one of the big things about open source is really, really good for really, really big companies to adopt, because they have the scale to do that, and they can sort of dedicate teams to this, and they can work, with an inner source model, even internally, and how they develop it, and they can become net contributors to very large scale projects. So if you look at something like Walmart in the US, it's one of the largest contributors to the kind of SEP storage project, which is an open source project, because they want to drive the next level of changes that they want to consume. So if you have scale, I think you have a superior opportunity. In many ways, I think in an SME space like Ireland, it's a little harder. So companies don't necessarily have those large-scale resources to dedicate to things. So they need to be able to look out into that kind of ecosystem and go, is there people who can help us with this? And we're not always great at promoting that, I think, internally as an island. I think the ecosystem could do more for that. And certainly, I think it's quite challenging when you go into some sort of competitive opportunities, because procurement on the receiving side is just not really set up to deal with open source in many, many ways. And they just, they're used to purchasing in a certain mode from certain types of large vendors. And, when you go in with a radically different approach, and you just don't fit with what they want to do. So that filter to get through is really quite challenging. And particularly so when you're doing software, pure software development, like we're integrating stuff that kind of exists, but for the guys who are doing pure, I'd say it's even harder maybe.
I mean, don't you bet. In Holland, they have a phrase, actually it's legal, it's from the Ministry of the Interior, which is called open tenzij, which means any bit of software they purchase as a government has to be open source, unless there's a very strong reason not to. That was introduced in, I think, 2019, thereabouts, 5-6 years in the market. The problem is it's not enforced in any way, shape, or form. No procurement that I'm aware of actually mandates it, even though the fact this is legal policy from the Ministry of the Interior. Right? So even when you do get the strong mandate, it's not enforced. So you're trying to be for like the good guy on the block, but the rules are not helping you, right? The procurement is not helping you. So I do agree with you fully that there's a massive opportunity in procurement to actually get more, if you like, demand side generation for the kind of work that we're doing.
We all look at our policy.
Yeah,
exactly. No pressure to you there, Sebastian.
So I've been thinking a lot of the context is that I think it was already discovered by Europe in the 70s that we were falling behind the US in terms of tech policy and in terms of competitiveness of our technology that we could provide. So the first couple of EU programs that were set up, it wasn't called the EU back then, but that were set up, were developed in the 70s, came into force in 1984, the earliest one of the predecessors of what's currently still running the Horizon Europe program. So that whole idea of we need to somehow find a way to catch up with in particular the US and the tech development there has been around for so long, but there has never been a model that has really worked for Europe. And you saying that there are so many SMEs, I think that is a general correct assumption for the whole of the EU, in particular in IT, where you have all of these small, very specialized businesses that can develop and that can provide you with technology that you need to solve certain problems. but how to make them work together. And I think open source is one of the opportunities that we have of making them work together, even though they might otherwise be competing on the market.
I think there is a broader point there on procurement that I think anyone who's done procurement, either large enterprise from a supplier side for large enterprise or for government, or even worse from the other side of the table, is even more work. But it can be, bluntly, for small business, crippling. And there are good reasons for that. That there are expectations that need to be met. There are processes that need to be in place. But you are quite aware that as small businesses serving open source, your economics tend to make you more technically heavy than necessarily having a sales and marketing team that can be funded out of your license fees. And one of the big areas around that is bid prep, bid management, all those things you need to do, but you maybe just don't have the resources that we had. One example that I will try and keep as simple as I can. But we had one example where we were looking at a particular procurement going in as one of a relatively small number of specialist providers in a particular area, and an extremely large company, the name of which we won't have everyone in the room, not a technology company. We spotted when it came out, the framing of it basically meant that they'd already won it by the time it came out. Now, that was despite the fact they wouldn't have even known what software was before the procurement process started. So now, obviously, with open source, they absolutely are empowered to do that. We found out because they came to us and said, do you want a subcontract? And in the end, I think the ultimate bid for that meant, basically that it exceeded the budget that was available. So nobody got it. So, how do you address that? Well, there are things, and I'm conscious that at the moment there is a process going on, I believe, that Irish government is looking at procurement, and I think there's been some interesting discussions around that. I think that some of the points that are raised there are going to be pretty key in trying to fulfill those objectives, putting it into a requirement. There's famously in UK, Francis Maud was... way I've had it told to me is Francis Maud was kind of coming to the end of his political career and went, everybody has to use open source, and hung around for a little bit and then left. And that's one of the reasons that there had been such a strong mandate in the UK. But then, how do you enforce that? Is procurement ready?
I want to make sure that we have time for questions. So I as a final thought, I'd like to invite you all to think about a word that you would give to organizations that are considering commercial open source as a way to move forward, or alternatively, what Ireland can do to kind of support that and illuminate this opportunity.
I suppose everybody talks about AI, and no different on this panel, I guess. If you look at the development of, I have another role outside of Securitix in terms of I'm involved in an organisation called AI Squared, which the AI Alliance for Ireland, which is like driving sectoral adoption of AI right across, or trying to drive that right across. And there's so much heavy lifting to be done there. But again, I think, really you have to understand the open source philosophy of how software gets developed, how that gets developed so quickly. That's why we'll expect for that to really come into play. I think we're seeing that. I think there's, we're getting access to talk to people in government and different things. So I think there is a willingness to do that, which is very encouraging. So if you're looking to, you are probably already using open source. It's just a question: are you going to be paying for it, and is it going to underpin some critical area of your infrastructure? It's more than ready, and it's more than able to do that with all the references in the world that would back that up. So I think from that perspective, people should look confidently at it and not just necessarily stay in the kind of the swim lane that they may have existed in for the last while.
Open.
You said that some procurement isn't really ready to buy open source yet, to embrace it yet. If I'm
to facilitate, I think some places are very good, as we know, but yeah.
And so one of the bigger topics that I'm working on right now is the reform of the European public procurement framework that's currently going on, and I do think, and we do argue that there is an opportunity for the EU to kind of set the very general framework right, so that more open source can be procured, so that the public authorities that want to but don't really know how to have more tools at hand to more easily do that. One of the tools being instating, creating OSPOs, open source program offices across the member states, across sectors. The previous panel was about procurement, and there was a bit of source code contribution questions there within public authorities. So I think there is this framework, and that also comes down to Ireland, because the Irish government will take over the EU presidency in half a year. There is an opportunity for that, and making this change is an opportunity for you now to approach these folks in government and to move that change forward.
For me, the word I would like to give is governance, actually. I have this argument, discussion with people sometimes. I see actually open source as an approach, a tactic, and a choice, right? But actually, for me, what's super important is actually what's the governance of either the community that's developing it or the company that's actually stimulating that particular open source piece into it. And what you actually observe, an example from again in the Dutch context is, the Dutch have a national identity provider called DigiD. About a month and a half ago, the company which actually was running that service just got purchased by an American company. And the whole Dutch public sector went, oh my God, right? Like everything in Holland is now under the jurisdiction of the US government. And what they didn't understand is that, yes, it was European technology, but the governance around that technology was not secure. And the same goes for open source, right? You can have a wonderful open source project, but if the governance isn't strong around that project, you are still vulnerable. Less vulnerable, but still vulnerable.
Very important. So would you like to go start?
Well, I think, again, I agree with that. But I think it's, one other area that I think is always worth thinking about is the positioning for people who don't have an interest. And I think that's, we've seen this particularly in cultural heritage space. So our work in Flax Teal, happy to discuss in different contexts, but particularly around cultural heritage, disaster resilience, and advanced physics, the traditional trifecta. But one of the things that we realize, particularly in the cultural heritage space, is people they don't necessarily have strong opinions about open source because of open source, but they have strong opinions about what it can deliver. And we have far more often seen people go, I really want that thing for these reasons. And when you put them together, actually the open source is a key part of that, but that's not how they're viewing it. And so I think that's, for an open source business, I think it's good to try and build that rapport and come back to Ireland. I think that's one of the things that as a community and as a business community is trying to help people, signpost people to the solutions that solve their problems, where those solutions are involved open source.
Okay, open for questions. So we've got a lot of them. We'll start in the back.
Yeah, so I'm curious to know, both for your own businesses as well as the clients you deal with, how they're dealing with the two hidden taxes of open source, which are, I suppose, increased DevOps workload as well as maintenance, and kind of how they're balancing that as they adopt more open source.
So is the question, John, in terms of because to develop this in-house is kind of, there's a cost to that?
Yeah, so say you adopt Postgres.
Yeah.
Obviously, you're going to need a team to maintain that. So how are they doing it through you or themselves?
Yeah, no, I suppose, so I understand your question. Yeah, so it's very much a combination of both. It's to do with scale in many cases. So if you have, and what you're betting the farm on, right? I mean, so if you are like a Flutter, and you have got lots and lots of people in that organization who are incredibly savvy about open source stuff and the workings of all of that. And they basically ensure that they're sort of self-sufficient because, their whole future is dependent on that. If you move that to an SME situation where somebody might be buying, often open source comes in through an application purchase, right? A software purchase. Somebody's buying a new HR system or whatever, and it happens to be based on that. So they have to have those skills, and that'll sit on a stack effectively of stuff, and they may be able to manage a bit of that stack, some of that stack, or so. And as you move out more into the SME sector, their ability to manage that stack varies hugely and goes down. So, I mean, you know, we would offer like managed services for companies like that, to, you know, to bring them back up to where they need to be. So there is a cost to that, but I think the last time I looked at Flutter's accounts, they looked okay. So I don't think they're doing too badly. And they obviously are seeing that they're making huge commercial gain from having that control, because ultimately, you know, despite open source's kind of global sharing, I mean, it gives you huge empowerment if you're that well versed in its adoption and use internally. And I think they're the examples that, you know, companies should be looking at really in terms of what the net return from an opportunity is.
Thanks, Brian.
I'm Karla Nieminen from the Dublin Linux community, but how I have made money is to sell American software to big enterprises, very closed source. So my question is related to that. Like you mentioned that, okay, there's the technical stakeholders and of course the technical benefits and questions of open source, and then there's the procurement. But who is often the decision maker? Might be like very business background CEO or CIO or operational leader who doesn't even know or care what software maintenance and things like that. So have you seen lately anything like interesting new initiatives or new ways how to bring the open source value to these like high level decision makers who don't have any technical background?
So I can take that. You see, obviously Trump is doing wonderful things in the context of digital sovereignty, and actually Europe being aware of what they're doing, right? So that landscape has changed. So the strategic importance of the digital foundations for society, that is landing. And people are no longer willing, at least within the context I operate, to actually accept closed source. So they're actually mandating open source in a lot of those interactions. So that landscape, and that's not someone that's to understand open source. These are strategic decision makers who are trying to say, actually, what are the choices we want to make for how we go forward as society? So the landscape has fundamentally changed in the last year.
I think just one point to that as well. I think sovereignty can be kind of like, in the open source community, sovereignty can be a slightly contentious term because ultimately it's a global effort, right? And we've seen lots of talks in the keynotes about that. I think for me, sovereignty is more about resilience and the ability as a country, a business or whatever, to be more in charge of your own destiny. So I think if sometimes people find it easier as CIOs or whatever to be, because they can sometimes read an article in the Irish Times and think sovereignty, and they kind of go, does that work for me? I'm not sure. In theory, yes. But then if you talk to them about resilience within their business and within their environments for working, they absolutely get that, because that's just an extension of something they've been thinking about for a long time.
I would jump in really quickly, I know, but one of the things come from a communications background, and I find that often in the open source world, because it's very much developer focused, there is a difficulty in translating from the technical world to the business world. And so when you think about how you can convey how important open source is to executives and those strategic decision makers, I often encourage people to look at the business framework. That particular stakeholder has a vested interest in certain things, and open source is going to be germane to one of those. And the way that you frame your value is based upon what their interest is and aligning that very, very well, because there is always an opportunity to align. It matters who you're speaking to and what their interests are, really. Go ahead.
Maybe just, I think sovereignty is still good as a term of speaking to policymakers and with politics. And I talked about it yesterday with a colleague that's around maybe, that said, why don't you call it agency? But I think looking at the possibility and the necessity of enforcing our laws in Europe, it is agency, but it is more than that. So I think sovereignty is appropriate there, but maybe within a business context, it is more agency, and there is a part of skill building and capacity building in there, where at a university here, and open source is the ideal subject to train your knowledge on, to innovate on. I think those would be the words that I would use.
Do you want to add?
some time back took a slightly perverse approach and said, we're looking for buyers who aren't going to send us a CTO. So we want to, when we're looking for people to sell to, not always, but we're looking to talk to somebody who doesn't have opinions about technical solutions. And one of the reasons is because we can make a more clear pitch around exactly those things. And what we would find, particularly in private sector, more so than in public sector, but you go and someone says, oh, wait, hold on, so open source solution. Open source, I mean, we want something commercial or something like that. Once you're into that discussion, it's a challenge in the sales process because someone's got a very set idea that you have to ship. When you talk to someone and say, okay, what are your primary concerns? There's a 2012 report, which is a while ago now, but I don't doubt this has changed. That was done in London around why people buy open source. Reason number one, and this is 13 years ago. Reason number one. Has anyone got a guess what reason number one was? They survey primarily public sector, but not just public sector.
It's free.
Nope.
Innovation.
Nope.
Scrutinize the code base.
Nope.
Community?
Nope.
Agency.
Nope. Actually, I thought someone was going to say it immediately, and I was going to think, oh, it's vendor lock-in ahead of everything else, including cost. Cost came in at a third. So again, I think that's, you were saying, how do you sell it to somebody who's C-suite, non-technical C-suite? You know, I think you hit the nail on the head. You hit what they're asking for.
Yeah, well, yes, we have 1 minute, 1 minute left, so I think that's probably going to conclude it because I don't know who can talk, but I want to say big thank you to all of you for being here and representing commercial open source. So round of applause.